by acknowledging the Pueblo, Navajo, and Apache peoples as we arrive into this space, who are the traditional custodians of our land since time immemorial, and to acknowledge the deep connections to the land and the significant contributions that have been made and continue to be made to the broader community statewide. And I'd like to honor the land itself and those who remain stewards of this land throughout the generations. I also, as we just kind of ground into the work that we have been doing as the Advisory Council on Racial Justice, I wanted to lift up the name of Mr. Rodney Applewhite today, and acknowledge that it has been 14 days since he was killed right here in our own state by the New Mexico State Police, and 14 days since his family has not received any answers as to what happened. And so, again, just a reminder that this is not something, police violence, state violence is not something that we are protesting that it's happening in other states. It's happening right here in our community, right here in our state. And so many of our recommendations, I was just listening to Senator Cedillo Lopez present to the CCJ interim committee on the bills she presented to us here. And my message to her earlier this week was, how would your bill impact this case now? That is a real case here in our state. And so with that, we'll just take a moment to pause. And this evening, for the first hour, we will have a presentation from the Commission on Civil Rights. And Mr. Baker and Alexandra Smith are here. And so I will pass the floor, the mic to you.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for inviting us to present. Alex Smith, who's with me, was the staff attorney and our sole lead staff person on the work that we've done since the commission was formed. And so I'm glad to have her with me today. Justice Bosson apologizes for not being able to join us, but he did have some kind of an emergency with his internet connection that in the times of COVID is making it impossible for him to join us right now. So just a little bit of background. The New Mexico Civil Rights Commission was formed during the special legislative session earlier this year, with 3 appointees from the governor, 3 appointees from the Senate, and 3 appointees from the House, with the specific charge of looking at one possible approach to improving accountability for government misconduct. And that was to look at bringing New Mexico in line with federal law in providing a cause of action where somebody can go to court and recover if their state constitutional rights are violated. That's been true under federal law since 1871. And New Mexico, since statehood, has not yet enacted a statute for the specific purpose of providing redress for a violation of constitutional rights protected under the state constitution. The majority of the commission came down in favor of the view that that's long overdue, and that given that these are the rights that are important enough to have made it into the Constitution as a foundational state document, they're fundamental rights that you should have the ability to vindicate if they're violated in court. So from the time we got up and going, which really was about mid-August, we had a series of involved meetings where we brought in presenters, retired judges, law enforcement perspectives through members of the commission, law professors, national academics who've studied, in particular, qualified immunity, respected lawyers in the community who've dealt with civil rights issues for decades, insurance experts, and then allowed local governments to present on concerns they have about the costs. And the bottom line was a vote in favor of proposing a statute to the legislature that would allow you to recover if state constitutional rights are violated, that would allow for attorney's fees to a party who wins, would not recognize qualified immunity, which I'll talk about in a little more depth, but that is a judge-made federal doctrine that provides a defense in civil rights cases that has been widely criticized across the ideological spectrum in federal court. And the question for us was whether to recommend importing it into state law, and the majority of the commission recommended against that. And then to allow for compensatory damages, damages that make a person whole for the injury they suffered, or designed to do that, recognizing that the civil court system only usually deals in money, which isn't an adequate remedy when somebody's harmed or killed, but is the best that the system has to offer. Injunctive relief and equitable relief, so that if something is an ongoing constitutional violation, courts can step in and stop it, but not punitive damages. And that was a divided vote on the commission as to whether to allow punitive damages. They are available in federal court, and those are damages that are designed to punish conduct that's way out of bounds, not just limited to the whatever the jury or judge finds as the harm the person suffered, but beyond that to try to deter future violations. The argument against it was that a lot of the concern about our proposals has been built around budget issues, and though punitive damages are hard to predict and measure against, and so there was a divide in the commission as to where to come down on that, and it ended up with one more vote in favor of limiting the remedy to compensatory damages. These are all recommendations that the legislature can pick up. Beyond that very specific focus that we were given by the legislature, we heard significant concerns about the Law Enforcement Academy, which is, in addition to being responsible for training law enforcement officers in New Mexico, supposed to be responsible for disciplining them and addressing their certifications if they've violated people's rights, violated the law. And that system, from everything we heard, including from the director of the academy, is in need of a major reconfiguration and a lot more resources to be effective. So we got our report done in mid-November, and it's divided up, and we're happy to provide it if you all haven't received a copy yet, but it's divided up with an executive summary that lays out from kind of a 30,000-foot view our recommendations. And then there's a separate appendix for each of those sub pieces that I talked about that goes into much more depth on the reasons we came down where we did. I've already talked a fair amount about the basic idea as to why we think there should be a statute that allows you to seek to recover under state law, but I want to kind of underscore it a little bit. New Mexico has to recognize every right that's recognized under the federal Constitution, but there's nothing that limits the state to those rights. And the New Mexico Constitution includes a number that are broader or different than the rights protected under the federal Constitution. One obvious example is that the New Mexico Constitution has an Equal Rights Amendment that protects against sex discrimination. That, as some of you may know, was pushed aggressively in the federal system and failed to be ratified. And that's been true for decades now. We have that in the state constitution. We also have a specific right to free and fair elections and the right to vote in free and fair elections. And so there's a state constitutional voting right that would not be protected under the federal constitution. That's just a couple of examples. The religion clauses that protect the right to freely exercise our religion are drafted more broadly under the state constitution than the federal constitution. So the bottom line is, as the law stands right now, and Alex is probably sick of hearing me use this example, but it's one that really stuck with me. If somebody slips and falls walking into a public building, they have access to the courts. If someone's right to freely exercise their religion protected under the state constitution is violated, if their rights under the Equal Rights Amendment are violated, if their right to vote is violated, they don't have access to the courts under the state constitution as the law stands today. And we think that that's a gap in the law that's important to fill. And so that's really driving the overall recommendation for the legislature to take action here. From there, and tell me, I'm happy for this to be much more of a dialogue. If people want to jump in, I'll take questions at the end for sure. But if anybody has thoughts or wants to jump in, feel free. But the next question that came before us was whether to recognize qualified immunity as a defense. And it's it's not widely known even among lawyers, but it's a significant issue in federal court. Qualified immunity means that if a state official violates your federal constitutional rights, you can't recover in federal court, even though there's been a statute around for over 100 years that says that you should be able to, unless you first do two things. One is establish that you can prove a violation of your rights. And the second, and the one where the doctrine really does its work, is you have to show that the violation was recognized under clearly established law before the violation occurred. And in practice, that means that parties are losing in federal court, not because they don't have evidence to show that their rights were violated, and not even because the law establishes, as the judge would find it for their case, that their rights were violated. But instead, they're losing because no one has violated the Constitution under almost identical facts before and had that called out as a constitutional violation by either the United States Supreme Court or the United States Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit for New Mexico. And so unless you've gone to either the highest court in the land or the second highest court in the land and had them recognize that under facts like in your case, there was a constitutional violation, you're done. That's the end of the road for your case. That has drawn concerns from everyone from Justice Sotomayor and Justice Ginsburg to Justice Thomas and Justice Scalia, just taking Supreme Court justice as an example, because it's neither tied to the history of the statute nor based on the merits of the case. It's an impediment to recover that is really outside whether you should win or not in court and based entirely on what cases have come before you. So the commission came down also in favor of not recognizing that as a defense under the state statute. Federal courts can figure out what they're going to do with qualified immunity, but as a matter of policy, we don't think that should be imported as a defense in New Mexico law. On the issue of qualified immunity, a lot of the pushback involves a misunderstanding of what it does and doesn't do. We heard a lot of feedback from law enforcement that it's important to protect against judges and juries taking the benefit of hindsight and second guessing what was a split-second decision that had to be made. And the misunderstanding there is that that's part of constitutional law as it exists. That's not based on qualified immunity. There's already a lot of protection, and people can debate the merits of how broad or narrow that protection is. But just as a matter of fact, the substantive law is already very difficult to win under on a constitutional claim, including in excessive force cases. So the idea that we're inviting, people to slow down what was a split-second decision and second guess it after the fact is just factually not correct. The burdens to win on constitutional claims are already high, and the commission's recommendation is just not to make it even higher based on something that's separate and apart from the merits of the case. We think that that it's better for those to be decided with the facts and circumstances of the particular case in front of the court or the jury. And again, looking at the criticisms that have come down on this, local federal judges who are not identified in any way as going out of bounds. There's some of the most respected judges in the state. Conservative judges have said that the most democratic way to decide whether someone's rights have been violated is for that to go to a jury. Beyond that, we heard from academics who've studied this nationwide, and what they found is that while qualified immunity doesn't get rid of a large number of cases, the cases where it's having its impact are in those like what I described, where you have a meritorious claim, you have evidence to support it, but you just don't have another case that lines up exactly with it, that shows the law was clearly established. And we think that's important to change. Similarly, it's been justified, qualified immunity has been justified as a way for courts to get rid of frivolous lawsuits. And there already are mechanisms in place for judges to deal with cases that don't have merit. We think it's more important for cases that do have merit to get a full and fair hearing. I talked a little bit about the damages we're recommending that be made available, and that's compensatory but not punitive damages, and then injunctive and equitable relief. On attorney's fees, we just think it's foundational that you need to be able to recover if you prevail. So this is not opening the door to anyone who brings a lawsuit to recover attorney's fees, but lots of constitutional claims involve very significant violations of people's rights, but don't involve huge damages that you could quantify. There are the cases that we know of that involve serious injuries or deaths. Those could still be brought in most cases without an attorney's fees provision. But if you don't have that, for example, for First Amendment protections, equal rights protections, oftentimes you can't find lawyers who will take the case unless there's an attorney's fees provision available, because at the end of the day, if you win, the best you're going to get is the court acknowledging that the right has been violated and some recovery for your client. But there's not a mechanism to incentivize lawyers to bring what we consider important cases that are at least as important as other statutes that allow for attorney's fees. Like, there's a huge range of those: the New Mexico Human Rights Act, the Whistleblower Protection Act, the Inspection of Public Records Act, the Open Meetings Act. Each of those is important. We just don't think that they're more important than a Civil Rights Act, and that the Civil Rights Act should be treated the same. The last piece, one of the last pieces before I go way into the kind of technical weeds here, was indemnification. And that means, should public entities that hire the employees who violate someone's rights have to provide a defense and pay a judgment or settlement if that employee violates someone's rights? And everyone on the commission agreed that there should be indemnification. For practical reasons, and really two we're taking the lead on this. One is there have been a lot of concerns raised that adopting a New Mexico Civil Rights Act will discourage people from going into public service, because out of fear that they'll lose their house, be paying out of their salary, judgments, settlements. We don't want to disincentivize good people from going into work in the public sphere. And so we didn't want to have that as an impediment to recruitment. The related piece, though, is also practical, and that's if you leave it to the officer to pay a judgment or the other public official to pay a judgment or settlement, the ability of the harmed person to actually recover goes down dramatically. The ability of an individual to pay a judgment or settlement, especially if something really bad has happened, is completely different than if you have the means to recover against the public entity that employs them. And then I guess the third piece of it is that in terms of creating incentives for accountability and reform, and this is maybe speaking for me personally, I've seen lots of circumstances where, rather than the case where it's just a proverbial bad apple who's violated someone's rights, a violation occurs based on lack of training, bad policies and procedures, bad supervision, bad tactical plans, major mistakes that you could have seen coming down the pike from the supervisor's level. And so by holding the agency accountable rather than just the individual officer, the goal here would be that you incentivize them to do better training, to take more care when they hire, to pause before taking an action and think through whether this is really the best next step or whether it's going to result in violating someone's rights. And so I think that's an area where there could be a lot of debate, but the commission came down unanimously in favor of providing indemnification. I think, from the perspective of the majority that made all of these recommendations, I think everyone would agree that this isn't a panacea. It's not going to fix all the problems that are out there. There are lots of different ways that you can come at reform. We just think that this is a basic step that could be taken to protect people's rights and keep access to the courts open for people whose rights have been violated under the New Mexico state constitution. we don't think that that document should take a backseat to the federal Constitution in terms of being able to be enforced. So I know that was quick. I covered a lot of ground. I'm hoping that you all have questions and follow-up that you'd like to discuss with me. I don't want to monopolize this with what could devolve into a pretty boring legal lecture if I go much longer. So I don't know if Alex wants to jump in and add her take from having handled the laboring oar on the report and overseen a lot of the legal research that went into what we did.
I think I'm just open for questions along with me.
Thank you. Thank you both for being here today. I'll open up for any questions or comments from the council members.
Alexandria, we have a question from Hussein bin Bilal in the audience who is asking, why should qualified immunity rulings be compensatory as opposed to being punitive? I wonder if this will truly hold the agency responsible.
Mark, did you want to answer? Or do you want me to answer?
I'm fine either way. Take your pick.
Why don't you answer?
Sure, I'll field this one. You know, it's a debate, and this is the one area where the commission engaged in a balancing act. I voted in favor of having punitive damages. That was a 5-4 vote. I thought it should be the same as federal law, but I can say that there were thoughtful reasons by the majority that voted against having punitive damages. And you're right that it may take away some of the sting in particularly egregious cases because the jury will be limited to awarding the damages that are measured by what was the harm to the person who brought the case. But on this, we were getting major concerns about how the act will impact small local governments in particular. You know, the state is in a better position than some small cities and counties to absorb a major judgment. And when we talked to the insurance people that provide insurance for local governments, they raised concerns that if we did everything, including punitive damages, they would have difficulty reinsuring and getting the coverage that they need to be able to pay if a major verdict comes in. And looking at it, I think the majority view was that while perhaps it would be better to have the full range, a concession in a gesture and a move in towards balancing the concerns of small local governments and counties was warranted on that point. And I see the reasons for that. You know, typically punitive damages aren't available against the state. That's not true in federal court, but in state court, there's been a long history of the Supreme Court saying we're not going to recognize punitive damages against the government based on the concern that planning for those types of judgments is very difficult. It's both hard to judge when they'll be awarded, and if they are going to be awarded, guessing as to what a jury will decide is enough to punish the bad conduct. And so it's a fair question. There's not a perfect answer to it, but this was a balancing act.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments from council members? Councilor Bencomo.
Madam Chair, Alex. Thank you so much, both of you, for being here and for the work that you've done. My name is Joanna Bencomo. I'm a city councilor in Las Cruces, New Mexico. And, even just, Mr. Baker, what you were just saying around we just had a settlement of $6.5 million in Las Cruces. And, as a counselor, as a social worker, I think about what we could have spent with $6.5 million, right? And also I had to consider, what happened for us to get there. There was a life that was lost, right? And so I hear some of what you're saying. And then additionally, I guess I wonder, in terms of the commission, what kind of conversations you had about like what it'll take for a culture shift, because what I heard you say, right, is that we don't want to discourage good people from applying to public service because they're afraid of they might lose their house. But really, I want people to be afraid that I might shoot and harm somebody. Like that fear should be greater than the fear of my own well-being in the long run if I do something bad, right? And so I wonder if you all had conversations around what it'll take to shift some of those cultures that are just so pervasive. And I think, often in my experience, we don't want to talk about those things publicly. And I think that that's a really big shame. And often for me, I feel as a counselor, I feel like my hands are tied, and we have to often discuss these things in closed session. And on one hand, I understand. On another hand, I think these conversations should be had publicly. And so I'm just curious your thoughts on that, and if the commission discussed some of those things.
Madam Chair, Councillor, we tried to stay, because of the limited time period we tried to stay very focused on the specific task of considering this act. And so we didn't go into the broader question of how do you, other than looking at this as a step towards reform, globally, how do you change culture and decrease the risk of unnecessary use of force broadly in law enforcement? That would have, I think we could spend a full year on that and still just be chipping away at the edges of it. It's a fantastic question. I don't have a great answer to how you more broadly fix it, but I would say, and this is piggybacking off something that the Speaker of the House, Brian Egolf, mentioned yesterday. He, when we were presenting to Courts, Corrections, and Justice, he made a point of saying that through history, you've seen lots of circumstances where the road towards real reform did come through someone who was brave enough to bring a court action to enforce a right, and that forced people to reevaluate, take measure, and change. And so, personally, I have some hope that that would be the case, and that, like you said, I first hope that people pause just out of basic humanity, and I think that that's true in most circumstances. That nobody wants to go out, and very few people want to go out and hurt people, and they want to make good decisions as public officials. And so I kind of start at the baseline that most still do, and that better training and supervision can lead to fewer incidents, and hopefully culture change that pivots away from problems that we've seen. It's just changing culture is hard, and we're seeing how that works out with some of the Department of Justice reform efforts across the country, where it takes time, it takes a monitor, it takes a lot of involvement sometimes to really shift perspectives. We just hope this would be a step in that direction.
I would add also, if I may, I would add that there was some discussion about how this might be able to help with some reform. While this isn't obviously the only thing that could help, there are certain things where when you have a municipality or a county or some state entity that is faced with the possibility of having these judgments against it, sometimes they will impose certain rules and take measures to try to limit their liability. And this can come through training measures, loss prevention measures that they undertake to try to have better training, to try to have accreditation programs, things like that can come out of this. And we would hope, and the commission certainly made recommendations that these sorts of measures should be taken to try to limit the liability, that basically do better training to not have as many constitutional violations. And that's a win-win for everybody. Then you don't have these entities having to pay judgments because they're not violating the rights in the first place. And that this could be an incentive to do some of that. And that was part of the commission's reports and part of the commissioner's reasoning.
Thank you.
Hello, this is Bishop Cooper. May I speak?
Senator Lopez had her hand up, and then we'll go to Bishop Cooper.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and again, thanks, Mark, for the presentation. I was able to hear the same presentation yesterday in Courts, Corrections, and Justice Committee, and part of the other discussion that we had was bringing in the torts claim as to how that could maybe be amended, worked with, utilized in place of what the discussion that we're having right now. So I just wanted to alert our members here that will still be brought up during our legislative session coming up now in January, especially as it goes in front of the Judiciary Committees, both in the Senate and House. So, you know, it's half one and half the other, I think, for some of the members as to how this really makes a change. And as Councillor Bencomo, as you mentioned, you know, it's a concern as to specifically how and what the costs will be for local government, but even for state, and actually, I think for the entity out there too. But as we know, sometimes the way that we make changes is in the purse strings, and it doesn't happen overnight. It's a change of culture, and it starts at the top, of course, with leadership and the training, I think, and everything else that needs to come into that those that work for government, that work for us, are doing the utmost best. And I know that one of the scenarios that was mentioned yesterday too by the speaker, of course, mentioned a case with a child who was in the foster system and who had been abused egregiously into where and what had happened. And, you know, when we talk even about foster families, they too are representing the state of New Mexico. So, you know, this is very encompassing as to where and what can happen when you talk about qualified, you know, the immunity issue. And I think there's still much more conversation that will be happening, especially as we begin to delve more into the particulars in the upcoming session. So I just wanted to mention that, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Bishop Cooper and then Austin.
I was muted. Thank you, Madam Chair Lady. Thank you, Mark, for your presentation. And I apologize for being just a few minutes tardy. But on the issue of immunity, I would just simply say that for our community, African-American community, especially the men of the African-American community, when we hear arguments about getting qualified applicants and that they would be turned away by the possibility of them being liable for some egregious act, for us, it sounds more of the same. And we do understand purse strings, but it does sound more of the same. And that's going to be a hard sell in the African-American community, from my perspective. If we're going to change culture, sometimes it has to be a sudden shift of some kind. And it doesn't mean that they should be liable, but I just think the thinking that we cannot recruit people because they are afraid of liability of egregious acts, that has to shift. Because when young African American men and women are dying and officers are not being even charged or relieved of their ability to serve in law enforcement, that question of trying to protect them even before they have effectively done their job seems to be egregious to us. And so maybe I missed part of that argument, but I think I heard enough of it that my concern is still a real concern. I think a lot of this has to do with those who are legislators and their relationship with law enforcement, and not wanting to, in my opinion, push the envelope. Thank you much. That's just my comment.
Madam Chair, Bishop Cooper, thank you for that. And just to be clear, in case you missed the first part, we're our recommendation is to get rid of qualified immunity. There was discussion of concerns about indemnification and keeping indemnification in place for the reason you mentioned, but also to allow for compensation so that people can actually recover. But on the qualified immunity front, we recommend against that. And in addition to the case that Senator Lopez mentioned, in our report, we list a number of examples of cases where we think it really underscores reasons that doctrine is causing people not to be able to recover in court in cases where they should, where the clearly established law requirement just doesn't. If you ask people on the street, does that make sense? I don't think you'd hear many voices saying that yes, it does make sense, and they include officers having shot a child laying on the ground while the officer was trying to shoot the family dog because a court had never before considered that, and therefore the law wasn't clearly established that you can't do that. And there's a list of examples that kind of underscore how that doctrine may have gone too far towards protecting against liability instead of keeping the courthouse doors open for people who've been harmed.
Thank you, Mark.
Austin, and then Dr. Patel, if you wanted to lift your question up.
Yeah, so I think I have probably I think I'm probably going to echo a lot of what was said already about my personal opinion is that I would want somebody who's entering law enforcement to be afraid to violate somebody's civil rights. My mom is an ICU nurse and she's liable for every single patient she takes. Her license is up, her way of life, she's the provider for, my whole family. So she doesn't get to have that kind of privilege to say, well, I maybe probably shouldn't have chosen a nurse because I was afraid of the liability of what would happen if I killed a patient. That's just my view on things, that if somebody were to try to go into enforcement where a lot of these come down to life and death, that they should be afraid to violate somebody's human rights. They should not want to kill people. They should not want to have that come into question. That is where I would approach it from, and that there is standing for other careers where the people are personally held responsible for the well-being of the people who they're enforcing and working with. My preference would be that there would be a reconsideration on that. I do understand the perspective around people being the necessity to provide healthcare and recovery, but the intention of a punitive settlement is not necessarily that it would cover the cost of recovery, but that it would serve as a punishment for the person to say, you can't keep doing these things and getting away with it. The other portion of that being that when we try to introduce new accountability like body cams statewide, we get people who are saying we don't have enough money for that when they're handing out 21, 40, $90 million in settlements. It's just not tenable. If they can continue to say that the well is bottomless and it's taking away from schools and other preventative stuff, it just does not make a whole lot of sense to me personally that we would say that a punitive settlement would have the same effect as recovery. I think that the portion that would come into recovery is probably like, well, then let's probably look at a state-funded Medicaid program, as opposed to saying, well, we have to make sure that when our police shoot somebody, they can take care of it. The answer is police need to not shoot people. And if people do get shot, that they could get care through the state to recover. But I hope that there's some other kind of answer and that I haven't been obtuse, but that is my personal view on where things are. But I'm happy to be convinced otherwise.
Madam Chair, thank you. And I actually thought that one of the great things about presenting to this group is that you all may have views that you'd like to be heard on when this comes up in front of the session. I mean, we made our recommendations and there was a divide, and I think that everybody on the commission worked hard in good faith to come up with the best recommendations possible, but I certainly don't hold us out as perfect. And there's room still for this to be considered from a number of different perspectives. And so informing you all, and I've been interested in following your work, making sure you know what we're recommending, and then opening the door for this group and others to weigh in with legislators. To me, that's how the system should work. And so I don't think you should take it as a foregone conclusion that what comes out at the end of the session will look like what we've proposed. I think there's still lots of negotiation that'll be, basically we just got it to the deciders, and the deciders will now get to lay out what they want to do with it. And so there's room to be heard from you all on these particular issues. And so I encourage that wholeheartedly.
Thank you. Dr. Patel?
Thank you, everybody. I just want to echo the rest of the council members. And, I think, I think at least I see this as, the responsibility of the state to act on finding some level of justice for acts of, racial injustice on individuals in some instances, especially given, police killing of a Black man outside of Las Lunas. We don't know the results of the case yet, but I think humanizing this conversation perhaps brings it more to the fore and may make it more helpful for us to understand what perhaps we should recommend. So my question then goes to, Senator Lopez mentioned that there is a kind of limit in the tort in terms of how much compensation you can get for compensatory damages. Would there be a limit similar to that, or was there consideration of a limit if we wanted to add punitive damages, as it seems like for bankrupting smaller communities was kind of prioritized in the consideration of whether or not the state needed to uphold its obligations under civil rights statute.
Madam Chair, to speak to that, I would say that under the proposal we've put forward, there would not be a cap on compensatory damages. And so the other way to come at it, or another way to come at it, would be to allow for punitive damages and set a cap. The hard thing with caps is that when they go through the legislature, they can get stuck at a point that gets outdated over time. And so they won't keep up with what the dollar means in future years. It's mentioned in the report in a section that says if the legislature ends up concerned about the fiscal impact of the legislation we're proposing, they could consider a cap. We have not recommended that they cap it. It just would be an alternative. And to go to your point about not losing sight of the humanity of what we're dealing with here, a point that I've consistently emphasized is that unlike in other fiscal analyses that the legislature goes through, where they're, say, deciding whether to build a road or improve a road or build a rec center, here there's a real value judgment that has to come into play, because the cost of government misconduct is borne by someone. It's either borne by the person or entity that's responsible for it, or it's borne by the victim who suffered the violation. And so that cost exists no matter what. Right now, it's being carried by the person who was harmed. And we think that the New Mexico Civil Rights Act helps to make sure that it's instead borne by the government entity or person who's responsible for having caused the harm in the first place. So we think that that's an important consideration. I hope that goes to kind of the point that you're making about this impacting real people. I don't think that the local governments certainly don't think that what we've proposed has overemphasized the budget issues. They're pretty firmly opposed and vocally so to what we're proposing here. But our consideration was keep that in mind, convince the legislature that in looking at the possible fiscal impact, that needs to be front and center, that there's a human cost to this, and then limit it to compensatory but not punitive damages as a gesture in the direction towards avoiding the concerns of particular local smaller governments. So like I said, it's a balance. I hope that answered the question.
Thank you.
Thank you. And now Fatima.
Hi, good evening, everyone. And just thank you, for preparing this very lengthy report and all the recommendations. And I just want to echo what everybody else has said on the council. And then I had a question more specifically. You mentioned briefly that there was a section on overhauling the law enforcement academy that would require significant resources. And so I had a couple of questions there. If there, I've been glancing at the report, but obviously it's quite extensive. If there were any kind of specifics you could provide about what you mean by that, what does that mean, overhauling the LEA? And what kind of budgetary implication, or is there a ballpark, or is that sort of what you're recommending is more investigation or examination of what that would require? And then aside from my question, just in hearing you talk about limiting liability to really decrease the likelihood that constitutional rights will be violated, I'm wondering, in terms of looking at the LEA, we've seen, and I've kind of been a broken record a little bit on the council, so I apologize. We've seen that the efficacy of sort of one-off trainings around race is really questionable, the data on that nationally. And so before we invest even more money in law enforcement, I wonder, what else can we do to really limit the liability that our constitutional rights will be violated? And in the report, if you talk about that, what are other ways to reduce liability? For example, hiring social workers instead of police to, respond to behavioral health crises, or what are the other measures through which we can kind of reduce that liability? Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So the Law Enforcement Academy, going into that was a reach beyond what the statute actually charged us with doing, which was the specific Civil Rights Act. That was the one area where we heard enough information that we thought we could just essentially flag for the legislature the need to look at that, particularly the certification process. Less about the basic training that they're receiving, but more on the how are they disciplining and dealing with the certifications for officers who've caused problems? Because what we heard was concerning about how long it takes for them to get a complaint through, for them to deal with those types of issues. And I saw it when I was prosecuting federal criminal civil rights violations. You would find officers who'd had a checkered past and bounced around, sometimes leaving a city department to a surrounding smaller community and just getting picked up there, and then having another problem with the new department. And we'd like to see that stop. In terms of the specific recommendations, we got into some detail on ideas for the legislature to consider, but we stayed kind of at a higher level on that because we didn't have multiple hearings on it. We had part of one of our meetings devoted to it. A lot of it was just that the single issue we were told to focus on has filled thousands of pages of law review articles, and academics spend their entire career looking at those issues, and we were kind of focusing on how to deal with it in between August 15th and November 15th. But on the Law Enforcement Academy, we recommended restructuring it. It seems strange to have it tied to the Department of Public Safety, where the state police is housed, because then they're both supposed to hold state police accountable and also answer to the department. That was one suggestion. giving more authority to the Law Enforcement Academy board, overseeing a director was part of the recommendation. Restructuring who's on the board to include a board certified psychologist, someone who is involved in dispatch, a county chief executive officer, and a municipal chief executive officer were ideas that were thrown around. And I think the legislature could spend a lot of time on this and maybe come up with different or additional ways to improve. Another suggestion was to fix the regulations in the New Mexico Administrative Code that govern the Law Enforcement Academy to give clearer direction for the LEA's enforcement authority. And then a third area was to maintain a database that tracks police misconduct. The district attorney in Albuquerque has taken a new step in that direction on material related to law enforcement officers that his office works with. And that's recently being rolled out. I think it's so new that there's not much feedback on it yet. But then the last recommendation was to fund the LEA enough to modernize its operations and fill staff positions. And that again was focused on the accountability side of the Law Enforcement Academy. We didn't look at issues like you mentioned with the efficacy of training on any particular issue, and definitely didn't have an opportunity to look at how training on racial issues in particular impacts the conduct of law enforcement and how that is playing out in 3 dimensions in the real world.
Fatima, did you have a follow-up question you wanted to ask?
Thank you for that. I was just wondering who elects or how is the LEA board selected?
Madam Chair, Alex, I actually don't know the answer to that. Do you?
I don't know the answer to that either. I'm not sure how that board is chosen. But there was a recommendation that it maybe be restructured. And I think that, and certainly given more authority.
Madam Chair? Madam Chair?
Yes, Senator Lopez.
Thank you. The Law Enforcement Academy Board is actually appointed by the governor for quite a few members. And I don't have the number in front of me, but the Attorney General also sits on that. There are some specific members that are named in the statute, but many of the members are appointed by the governor.
Okay.
Okay, I know that because they've come through the Senate Rules Committee for many years. And there are specific persons who should be sitting on there with some qualifications. But again, it's the governor who makes the appointments.
Thank you, Senator Lopez, for that clarification. And then I just see Professor Montoya asked in the comments, did the commission hear, I think it keeps going unmute. Bishop Cooper, your phone keeps going mute and unmute, and there's a bit of feedback.
I'm sorry. I was going to comment about the state police board because I've been working with the governor's office around that issue. And then can I just briefly say that most of those positions have to be filled with chief of police from the municipalities, and all of them have a certain type of person that has to fulfill that board. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that clarification. And then Professor Montoya asked in the chat, did the commission hear from Black Lives Matter Albuquerque about their report? About your report?
Madam Chair, we didn't have a separate presentation from Black Lives Matter. The way we dealt with public comment, and again, this was in part a function of managing the limited time period that we had, was we created a survey that was on the commission's website and that was, I hope, widely distributed to get feedback. It was overwhelmingly in favor of recognizing a New Mexico Civil Rights Act and not recognizing qualified immunity. I wouldn't be able to know if members of Black Lives Matter Albuquerque were among the respondents, but I felt like, and Alex took a close look at them as well, that we got a diverse cross-section of the community weighing in through the feedback we got. I think we got 200 responses or something along those lines.
When it came to public comment, I don't remember seeing anything from Black Lives Matter ABQ. We did have weigh-in from other coalitions working around civil rights reform, including some bipartisan bipartisan groups that weighed in, including the including many of like the ACLU, as well as more conservative like Americans for Prosperity and the Institute for Justice. So there was a wide swath of organizations that did weigh in, as well as and then individual comments as well from people all over the state, from all kinds of different backgrounds.
Thank you. Dr. Sanchez, thank you for that information in the chat as well. Any final questions or comments?
Madam Chair.
Yes, Senator Lopez.
And I apologize. This is one question I didn't even ask yesterday, and I have not completely read the report, Mr. Baker, so I'll catch up on it. But by chance, did you all in your discussion, besides the Law Enforcement Academy Board, did you also mention the Public Safety Advisory Commission?
Madam Chair, no, Senator Lopez, we that did not come before us. I, having heard from all of you, I realized we probably feel like we did a very narrow slice of all the possibilities that are out there, but it was enough. It was a lot to cover in the short run, but we didn't look at that as well. All of these are, as I said, it's not a panacea. There's lots of different ways to come at it, and that was just not something that hit our radar.
And thank you. And the only reason why I mentioned that also for members of our council is that is another area of oversight in the Department of Public Safety and how they deal with the state police chief. For anything that happens with regards to potential, and these are again affecting state police only, but for any infraction or whatever may happen, this particular commission makes recommendations and has hearings with regards for any recommendation of removal, suspension, or such of a state police officer. And then that, of course, is given to the state police chief. So that's just another venue also that exists when we're talking about not just all of our police, of course, that the Law Enforcement Academy Board has oversight on, but this is even just dealing specifically with our state police officers. So just an FYI. Thank you.
Alexandria, are you trying to speak, or is someone trying to speak? Because I'm not hearing, I'm seeing people try to speak, but I'm not hearing anyone.
I think she's saying, wait a minute. I think she might be having some trouble.
Okay. Oh, her control thing. Okay. I can unmute you. I'll unmute you. Go ahead.
That's the strangest thing. My apologies. My entire control panel just disappeared. Which does not help. Okay, thank you so much. I apologize for that. Any final questions or comments for Mr. Baker and Ms. Smith? Councilman, did I see your hand about to go up?
I did want to ask a question, and it's not at all to sort of put you on the spot or, but I am wondering just in terms of the public commentary and what Margaret said earlier, just about, you know, who was engaged, and you said there were around 200 people, and I'm just wondering what kind of data points you collected about that. I did just have a quick scroll down to that appendix in the report, and it's kind of hard to read in the PDF as it sits now, but I was wondering if you know, how did you disaggregate that data? I saw there's like a lot of law enforcement folks and attorneys, but did you look beyond just employment per se at age, race, and gender, and really thinking of who's the most impacted by this issue? So which communities need to be engaged in the solution? So I'm just wondering, and if you don't know off top who was engaged, that's fine, but just if you had thinking around that of who was engaged and if you feel like this really is representative of our state.
Madam Chair, I would describe the public comment as in some ways anecdotal. It wasn't scientific and gauged to catch a specific cross section, and we drill down as far as it shows in the report, but I don't think we tried to disaggregate by age or race or anything along those lines. If my memory serves me correct, we didn't ask that specific question in the questionnaire. I think we left it open for feedback on the issues that were before the commission, but didn't get into the demographics in that way. But I do think that that's an opportunity now as it moves to the legislature. If people feel like anyone that's on but not actively speaking, and everybody who's on the council, everyone should be heard on these issues. And so as it goes to the legislative process, it'll be wide open to lots of feedback.
Thank you so much. And I want to be mindful of your time. Thank you for presenting your report and sharing your process with us here today. We've been very interested. We were created around the same time as this council and the commission through statute. And so we've been waiting to hear what the report was going to be. And we fully understand the major lift and amount of work from August to November to get a report ready. So thank you and the other members of the commission and Alexandra and the law clerks that helped, the law interns that helped on this, for doing this important work in our state. My just final question is the work of the commission now viewed as being complete from what was created in the special session, from the bill that created the commission?
Madam Chair, we're formally constituted through the end of March, I think. So I think that's primarily to be involved in appearing before committees and councils and educating on the report and the work that we did and being available to the legislators during the session. If there aren't other questions, I'm happy to field more, but if they're not, I just want to say how honored I am that you all invited us to present. I had noted that the council was created right around the time that we were formed and was interested in what you were doing and thrilled to get a chance to talk to you all about what we've been working on.
Thank you so much. And we'll be talking a little bit about what we've been working on shortly. And so if you can and want to stay on, you're welcome to. Any other questions or comments that you all have for Mark and Alexandra right now? All right, I don't see any. Well, again, thank you so much for all of your work and for your time today. We really, really appreciate you.
Thrilled to do it, and I'll stay on. I'll be interested to just ride shotgun now and listen to what you guys are saying.
Wonderful, thank you. Amy, it doesn't look like the governor has been able to join just yet. Is that right?
I've joined.
Oh, where are you? I didn't see you.
I had trouble logging in. I apologize. So it took a minute.
Well, thank you for being here.
You're welcome.
Resituate. I see some folks waving. So before we get started, Governor, thank you for joining us. I wanted to ask if there were any comments you wanted to make before we start sharing some of our recommendations we have arrived at.
I don't want to belabor, particularly since I am late, and I know folks have been working hard all day, but Ms. Taylor Alexandria, you've done an amazing job leading this council. For folks who know, we put this together rapidly because of the urgency of these issues, and getting as many folks together to really start not just collaborating, but really identifying strategies to deal with the reality of systemic institutional racism, frankly, in every context. And so it's a pretty broad mission with a significantly heavy lift, but we must and will do it. And I need to tell everyone, nobody said no about joining the council and participating, and it's been really hard work. And my goal is to participate as meaningfully as possible. And that's hard in COVID. And I apologize that there are so many pressing issues, and this among them, that these are life and death issues that we face as a community every single day, and we must and can do better. And I'm just very proud of this work. I'm also incredibly gratified by the commission's quick work on behalf of the legislature and my office, and the collaboration here today to look at ways to continue to work together and establish mechanisms for, frankly, I'll use that word again, institutionalizing justice, equity, equality, and making sure that racial injustice gets addressed in every context that we can. And so it's a great time for me to say thank you for doing all of this incredible work at a time in our nation's history that people will reflect about the leaders, that's you all, who stood up, who did something to make a difference, who left no stone unturned, who had the courage and the fortitude to peel away and look at the truth square on, even when it's harsh and tough, and you're doing it. And I'm just really proud of you. And I'm proud to be associated with this group of leaders. So I'm excited to hear about these recommendations. And I know that you've presented them to my office, and I appreciate that. So, they torture me if I don't get it exactly right. So I'll try not to embarrass Amy, our brand new, very effective director for the Office of African American Affairs, another rock star in New Mexico, and Miss Caroline Burkle, who's been also leading right out of my office, who does, frankly, everything. I promised to, I read everything, Miss Burkle, so I'm ready to rock and roll, I believe.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Governor. We have over 50 recommendations that have come in this interim report. And so this group, this council that is represented here this evening, as well as those who served on the 3 subcommittees, have taken this charge very seriously, and the lift and the amount of work that they have done, I am really inspired by and grateful for. And I think we want to start by thanking you for your leadership through this entire pandemic as well, while we're addressing these dual pandemics of racism and COVID-19. And so just thank you for your leadership and vision in establishing this council. I too want to express my sincere gratitude and acknowledgement of the incredible staff who have supported the work of this council. Amy Whitfield, Shawnee Harvey, Kaylee Salazar, Andrea Tammy Watson, Caroline Burkle, Jane Wishner, and Mary Lou Kramer. Without them, really, where we are today would not have been possible. And so we have so much gratitude for them. You were with us at our very first meeting on August 24th, and here we are today. Since then, the members of the Central Committee and the 3 subcommittees have met bi-weekly to move the work of this council forward. And so many of those in your executive leadership and across state government have taken the time to present to the council, to answer our questions, to help with the research that we asked for, and to provide resources and data that have helped inform the priorities and the recommendations that are being presented to you today. And so we express our gratitude for their time and their expertise in moving our decision-making forward as well. And then lastly, I want to thank all of the members who are on the council for this advisory council for racial justice, for their incredible commitment to community and to racial justice in our state. The amount of time and commitment and expertise that each member has devoted to this work and has brought to the council is deeply inspiring, and it shows the resilience and fortitude that exists within our state. I think you know the incredible advocates that make up this council and how fortunate we are to have each of them in our state. So this interim report sets forth the priorities of the council and the recommendations being made to you at this time. And as I said, we currently stand at just over 50 recommendations. I am not going to read all of them to you this evening. And we stand available if you or any of your staff have questions or want to go deeper into how we arrived at those recommendations. So one of the top priorities of this council is to establish permanency of the work of the council in our state government. And our recommendation is that this be done by establishing a racial justice commission, with the goal of that leading to the creation of a permanent office of equity within the next 10 years. And the importance of moving forward racial justice in our state by instituting the commission into statute is an acknowledgement that racial justice and systemic change takes time, it takes institutional support, and it takes real resources. And so the council proposes an executive order and legislation to establish the Racial Justice Commission with a sunset of 10 years or at the establishment of an office of equity. And we propose the commission should have the authority to convene, draft, and implement legislation and policies, and that the commission will create the infrastructure to establish a path for Office of Equity to oversee the implementation of the recommendations from the current Advisory Council on Racial Justice. We also spent quite a bit of time talking about law enforcement and criminal justice reform, specifically by looking at legislation that has been introduced before. And so the council recommends your support of previously introduced legislation, such as Senate Bill 17, which addresses excessive versus deadly force, Senate Bill 284, addressing school resource officers, and support for the Memorial to Study Law Enforcement Training, which was formally introduced as House Bill 3. And I will say, in addition to this central committee and the 3 subcommittees, we had 7 work groups that combined members from the central committee and those subcommittees that really looked in depth at some of these specific subject matter issues. And so these recommendations come from a work group that looked specifically at law enforcement and criminal justice reform related to that previously introduced legislation. And then we also enthusiastically endorse and recommend your endorsement and support of what has formally been introduced as HJR1, the proposed amendment to invest an additional 1% from the Land Grant Permanent Fund to pay for early childhood education programs. And this proposed constitutional amendment, as you know, addresses the dire condition of children in New Mexico who face multiple challenges as shown in New Mexico, ranking last in the kids count overall analysis of the 50 states. And these structural inequalities that burden New Mexico families and children are the consequences of historic and contemporary systemic racism. And we feel New Mexico has a unique opportunity to address this by using the massive permanent fund that creates opportunities to redress historic race-based inequities, redistribute wealth to communities of color from which it was taken, and benefit the entire population. So I'll pause there because I've done quite a bit of talking just now to see if there's any additions or questions or comments that have come up just yet for you, Governor, or any of the council members, and then I'll continue on.
As you're getting questions from council members, an area that I know my office highlighted, and I'm grateful for that, is we think that there's so much more work to do in the criminal justice system. And we know that that's, the back end of all of the problems that show themselves in terms of racial inequities, poverty, and all of the related social determinants that we try to get our arms around. They show up in unfair and over incarceration, and particularly of men and women of color. So I think there's more work that we can do there. I know that you all did incredible work. And I also think that you should expect, and we're going to want your feedback, is that we have the opportunity to deal with some of our law enforcement academy issues and training inequities right now. And that shouldn't be the end of it. It should be the start of making sure that we are doing better in that regard. And I'm not satisfied that that's occurring. And I also think that we need to also be on the education side, and you haven't talked about that quite yet, but we want to be making sure that we're making investments in education. I can see we need public health, population health education, and public education. We need to have racial justice concepts, particularly with social media. And I don't mean to digress, but that's not going away. And so the opportunity for particularly young people, but certainly not exclusively, to get access to hate speech and misstatements and lies, in fact, non-credible information, inflammatory information that I think actually does gaslight all of these issues. We need to have a solid public educational format that counteracts that really creates kindness, earnesty, respect, and equality. And I don't know what that looks like in the context of a early childhood, through career training and educational system. But I think it goes without saying, we're going to need that. This country needs that everywhere. And I believe that New Mexico can lead in that environment. So that's an area I still want to keep working on. Again, it's not a complaint. I just want you to know that in terms of permanency, it looks like I've already leaned in to say, of course, we're going to need that because we've got so much work to do. And I want you to feel like we're not going to wait for the legislature for things that are within our power. It isn't the be all to end all. It's not the end. You have to have a role in making sure we get it right. And we want to keep embedding it in other places. And of course, the permanent fund is a dramatic yes. And that's going to it's always a hard issue. We want to make sure we've got enough. And Alan Sanchez can tell you that he's got the advocacy scars, if you will. And he'll tell you areas where, the legislature's been right as fiduciaries about some of their concerns, and areas where they haven't leaned in enough to make sure that they're providing resources to the families who need them most. He can do both of those things. Here, we have total alignment. It will help in every category, every single one. And this is the time for us to come together and get it done. And I feel very good about the chances to do that. And you should expect that actually to be one of our priorities, not just something we would sign, not just something that we would ask you to be good advocates for, but something that we are full on. That's a bill that I need my name on, unless that hurts its chances of getting passed and get it upstairs, whatever it takes to get it upstairs. So I just want you to know that I'm grateful to have support on these really incredible issues. And it's another group of experts, right, who get to weigh in, particularly with some of our brand new legislators. So you add such value in an area where, no better expert, and I know there are others, because I don't have a full screen up, than Alan Sanchez, but we need more folks speaking at it from a variety of different perspectives, including racial justice, because we have inequities. And I'm grateful to have you by our state side to make this a reality this session.
Thank you so much, Governor. And all of the discussions have been very vibrant and in-depth. And I think that one of the reasons why we felt so strongly about needing to establish this work and create permanency is because it is the long game. And we're looking forward to seeing some of these short-term goals implemented, but also recognizing that we have much work to do in our state to get towards racial justice. So on to more recommendations. We, the council, also recommend that the governor issue an executive order to screen persons in custody in a facility under the jurisdiction of the New Mexico Corrections Department for substance use disorders and to provide evidence-based care inclusive of all medication-assisted treatment. Services should be initiated within 24 hours of arrival and should include referral prior to release to a community provider providing a similar service array. We also recommend that you direct the Department of Workforce Solutions to develop concrete steps to implement a program of paid sick and family medical leave. And that you support the Reduce Institutional Racism bill introduced by Senator Linda Lopez. That was formally introduced as Senate Bill 7 in the 2020 special session in July, now that we've had another special session. And one of the clearest ways to bring about racial justice is to enact policies to address institutional racism, as we've been discussing. And so we believe that the bill should address key components of the anti-racist transformations needed, including hiring, retention, pay equity, community engagement, practicing intersectionality for data collection, tracking, evaluation, accountability, as well as including a preferred criteria on demonstrated commitment to equity inclusion for all job ads for hiring and equity liaisons. We also recommend that the governor support and issue an executive order to change teacher licensure, administrative licensure, and alternative teacher licensure requirements to include anti-racism values and practices in alignment with the Yazzie and Martinez court case. We recommend that you direct the New Mexico Corrections Department to add to their strategic plan, mobilizing efforts to systematically divest from private prison systems and move forward with bringing back all prisons within the state under the control of the state of New Mexico. And that we recommend that you support a memorial for a task force to study and review the talent acquisition strategy and hiring requirements for New Mexico State Police and New Mexico Corrections Department, which can be merged with Representative Gail Chasey's bill that has been previously introduced. And there was also a major recommendation that we look at ethnic studies within our state education system, and that be applied from a critical race and intersectional lens. And so those are our highlights that we presented to your senior staff as well. As I mentioned, we do have at this time over 50, I think it's 54 short-term and midterm recommendations that we have made in this interim report, and look forward to continuing this work to establish it going forward.
I want to make sure that I don't steal anyone's thunder. I mean, we've got some incredible experts who I have no doubt are already working with advocates and policymakers in the legislature, as they should. That's the whole reason to have this group selected and put together. And I want to make sure I don't minimize anyone's chance to make sure I get on the right side of and understand these issues so that I can be a quality advocate in my own right.
Yes.
I don't see the chat, so I'm going to have to lean on you.
Thank you, Governor. I want to give just a moment for short comments if there are any members of the council that would like to make a comment. Oh, no, Mom, now you all are getting quiet. Mr. Sanchez, you're on mute.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Hear me? Okay, thank you. To the members of this committee, the commitment of people showing up to these meetings and to the subcommittee meetings and to the breakout groups, that's impressive. You know, I've been in a lot of committees over the years, and this group is committed. And Governor, thank you so much on behalf of everybody in this committee. And our support and heart is with you. You've led us well through this pandemic. We can see the light at the end of the tunnel, but you are saving lives, and we're behind you on that. 100%.
You know what, Ellen, I needed that today. I shouldn't really use this group as a place for cathartic conversations, but they are good for one's mental health. 40 deaths today. I literally get sick to my stomach. And, you know, I do this every day. I know that you all read it, but I go through those reports and it's heartbreaking. And the day before that, 2 30-year-olds we lost, and both of them had no underlying conditions. And I had a debate, you know, with a elected policymaker who was really concerned about our reset, rightfully so. These are not easy decisions, right? The pandemic is not fair. And it's just mitigating how bad the issues are, right? It's just so until we get the vaccine and get it credibly out there in the way that it needs to be out there, which will take about a year for all of it, it's really hard. And I remember saying, look, we got to do this reset. And this person really disagreed. And I said, here's the issue. For me, even the hospital capacity, which is dramatic, right? Our pregnant mamas aren't going to be able to deliver babies anywhere in this country, including New Mexico. If you're in a traffic accident, I can't promise that your trauma care can get done quick enough to save a limb. If you have a stroke, I can't promise that you can get in and get the stroke medication that will save your life, because we don't have the resources. And this is true everywhere in the country. But the part for me is I told this policymaker, you know, look, we've gotten a little numb to 9 and 10 deaths or loss a day on average. It will get to 50, 60, and 70 in short order. It will be quick when every New Mexican is impacted directly. Someone in your immediate family will have COVID. Someone that you know will get really sick from COVID. Worst of all, someone you love and know will die from COVID. And it shouldn't take that to get everyone to do better. And my job is I will not allow that to happen without trying to blunt it. And it's going to get really tough in December, but I'm proud of New Mexicans. You know, they're working hard to get it done. And, you know, we saw proof in the pudding. One county went from red to yellow. You really can. These measures can work, but everyone has to do them. There can be no exceptions. And so I really appreciate your kindness, because it's hard. And it is. People have lost their entire livelihoods. People don't know how they're going to pay these past due utility bills. Folks don't know if they can stay in their houses. People can't pay their childcare bills. I mean, it's real. And for me to tell you when we're dealing with poverty that this doesn't add to that or add to food insecurity is also untrue. And so there are no good solutions here except to do our very best, save lives. And I'm really proud of the New Mexico legislature. And it was bipartisan. You know, Congress can't get a stimulus package out, but the poorest state in the nation did. And I want you to think about that. The poorest state in the country got a stimulus package out in one day. And we'll do another one in January. And that's going to mean some tough choices for things that we know. You know, we don't want to stall out all of our good work. But we're going to do our very best to make sure that New Mexicans aren't afraid of losing their homes and their cars and having their family split apart, and that their food insecurity is going to get addressed. And it's going to be hard. And we're all going to pull together. So you've made my entire evening, and I appreciate that. And let's all commit that just like these racial justice issues, which are real and horrific and devastating and not our proudest moment in this country or state, that the only way that you really deal with them is to admit them head on and to do everything you can about it. And that's why I love this council. These are not easy issues, and they should be debated fiercely, fairly, and you do that. And I'm proud of you. And thank you, Alan.
Governor.
Yeah, Representative.
How are you?
I am doing as well as can be expected.
You look pretty relaxed.
Oh yeah, well then I'm doing my makeup. Does wonders. And thank you for no one on this call thinking A, that I'm in Hawaii, fake news, and B, that I have a hairstylist. My hair turned white, and by next Christmas, you will be mistaking me for Santa Claus, because that's the kind of weight gain issues that are occurring in stress eating related to COVID.
So Governor, I am extremely encouraged by this Racial Justice Council. And I know we had a subcommittee that dealt with whether or not it should become going to statute. And I read the notes back and felt like this is the time to do it. This is the time to move forward and create this council, especially for the state of New Mexico and especially for the times. What is your opinion regarding that?
So this is going to sound like I'm not very favorable, and I promise you'll be happy at the end. So as this incredible leader in the legislature, I worry a little bit about the number of permanent positions, in fact, I've been wanting to look at commissions and boards. We have a lot of them in the state of New Mexico, and sometimes they don't get the attention or support, and it's unwieldy and it's expensive. It's a hard thing. And we're a state per capita that I think's got more cabinet and offices than most states. And that's something I think about as well. And so I've been long, as the representative will tell you, I've been kind of like, oh, can we organize ourselves a little better? Can we be more streamlined? I worry about merging departments, but are there places where these alignments would make more sense? And then there's efficiency savings and those kinds of things, which New Mexico needs. And yet we made a brand new early childhood education department. So there's an example where we consolidated but built up and built out because it wasn't working in the system we had as well as we would like it to. So that brings me full circle. I just don't want anyone to say, wait a minute, you wouldn't do an office, a brand new department. I put it inside economic development of outdoor recreation, and you didn't do this for healthcare. And we still want to be careful about just having debates in the legislature about the size of government, right? If it does really good work, nobody cares about how small or how big it is, right? It should always be efficient and transparent and truthful. But if it's doing good work, we aren't doing enough work in this space. So I think some permanent structure is the only way to assure that it gets embedded. Because if government doesn't have it embedded in its own work, it won't get embedded in every other aspect of our work and daily lives. So long answer so that I don't get in trouble later when someone says, but you said no here or you said no there. I think this is a really important place for permanency.
Thank you very much.
Yep. So I'm going to remind you in a committee hearing to repeat what I said so I don't get myself into trouble, young lady.
I will.
Thank you for that question, Representative, and thank you, Governor. I think when we were thinking about the permanency, there is no part of state government that this work would not touch, and how important it is. I want to be mindful of time because on my agenda, we are over time that we had allotted with you.
Today is an incredibly challenging day for me, and so I am a little bit late for the next thing, but I feel disrespectful, and you don't. That's not something that you do to me. It's my own response to the incredible leaders that are on this call. You've done really good work. We're going to figure out. Our goal is to enact as many of your recommendations in as timely a fashion as we can. Otherwise, there's no reason to have a council. There's no reason to have a civil rights commission. There's no reason to do any of that work. And figuring out how we do that. Some of this, as you pointed out, can be done directly by us already, by executive order, by just directing the cabinet, by changing some of our policies. And some of it we're already doing, but I don't think that people see that we're doing enough of it, like our efforts to really have corrections be a public system, and that we shouldn't have a perverted system of creating a private sector reliance on funding for incarcerating human beings. There needs to be a different way to look at that. And I agree with you. And, you know, we did that certainly in Clayton. And one thing I want to be mindful of that is accurate and true. And of course, the representative knows this because she sees the LFC reports and she is tough. And her job is to make us accountable as a public body. And I take no disrespect at that, even when I'm like, oh, I'm trying so hard. I want those jobs. I want people to do what they should do. We're at a very interesting, crucial point for government. And I'm going to sound a bit whiny again. I apologize. In the last effort, you know, the last governor had an anemic budget or worse, was having to make incredible hard choices about cuts. So was the legislature. And whether we agree or disagree, and I think you should have invested a little more to try to mitigate what those end results were in terms of the budget. The issue is that when I took office, we had a 40% vacancy in some of our key departments and more than a 25% vacancy in just child welfare in CYFD. I mean, if you're not answering calls about abuse, neglect, and exploitation in a timely manner, we got trouble and we weren't investigating. And that was true in public health. It's true everywhere. And we've been building that up with, I think, some real success. But we weren't anywhere close to having that resolved, and the pandemic occurred, and state government is beyond its bandwidth and capacity. So the way in which we talk about capacity, we're in our own critical care standard. And so some of the things about, you know, screening and creating more reviews, I have to think about how we're going to be able to do that. And we can. There are ways for us to be more effective and efficient. And the good news is government wants this. Your leaders in the cabinet signed up to work as cabinet members to achieve these. But I also want to be really transparent that a lot of the work that we want to do is a little bit delayed, given that, and I know, so remember to thank your public health workers. Those folks and our National Guard and our first responders, right now firefighters have been trained to do COVID testing. Most of those folks, those public health nurses, docs, and clinicians haven't had a day off and are working 15 to 18-hour days since January. Not one holiday. And there's no light at the end of the tunnel. And so I want to be mindful of, please don't take, if anything seems like it's just not moving as quick as it needs to, that we aren't embracing these credible recommendations. And I just thought it was important to say that and to be earnest to the representative, you know, and we have talked to them in their caucuses that New Mexico is beyond, frankly, its capacity to deliver public services. And it's my job to fix it. So we're going to fix it, but it is a heavy lift. Even in corrections, the only thing corrections is doing right now, you know, we're meeting our obligations in parole. We've met our bench line marks for making sure that we decrease the populations based on state law. We've done that, but we've got a COVID problem in corrections, and it's significant again. And so all day long they do that. and providing that healthcare treatment inside our correction system has also proven to be quite challenging. So, for example, to take on another prison by ourselves right now would be impossible, or correction system. And so we are there on the policy, and we might need to work with you and get your recommendations about timelines that are meaningful. Does that seem fair? Did it sound like I wasn't going to do the work that I'm intending to do? Because that's not how you should end this call. My intention is to do better every single day.
Thank you, Governor. I think we take our charge as the advisory council to the governor quite seriously. And just before you leave, you know, having you as our governor create this advisory council on racial justice at the time that you did has elevated this work in our state. And there's an interest all across the state. I know I have heard from many people and organizations, and others on the council have as well. And so, you know, folks are interested in what we're doing and are anxious for a report out of what we have done. And so we look forward to hearing from you what will be moved forward and what those next steps will be. And so thank you for that.
So we'll try to put together a framework like this is what to expect on the governor's call. This is what to expect where we can be supportive with the legislators, which we do already. So the representative will tell you, I try not to have a governor's call that's 1,000 bills, but we are supportive in any number of ways and will. And these are things that we are working towards administratively with a kind of not a report card, but a sense about timing, right? And what steps that we will need you to help evaluate, including some of the training aspects that we haven't accomplished yet, but need to be accomplished and can be at the Law Enforcement Academy right now. And we can do better on that right now.
Thank you so much. And I've done a lot of talking, but I also I want to publicly thank you, Governor, for allowing me the opportunity to chair this council. It's honestly been one of the greatest honors in my life to serve in this capacity with so many incredible folks and advocates in our state. And so I just really wanted to make sure you know that, and everyone that I've had the opportunity to serve with here on this council knows that.
Well, I've got one last thing to say before we end. Don't think that your work is done, any of y'all. And so we will, the permanency is about making sure that we keep this talent in a way that's meaningful for you and is respectful of your full-time day jobs, night jobs, weekend jobs. But we've got a lot of work to do in the state, and we cannot, that's part of our bandwidth. Even if we could do it, we need your opinion and expertise, and we can't do it without you. And have no intention of doing so. So this is not my last effort with this incredible group. And I really am proud of you. And I appreciate that you gave me the opportunity to say that.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Governor. I see a standing ovation for you.
All right, I'm going to go to my next thing. You guys wrap up in any way that you need to. Stay safe, wear your mask, socially distance, no hugging. I know that's the worst part for me, but not until you're all vaccinated.
Thank you, Governor.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Governor.
All right. Thank you all for getting through that really quickly. So our final thing in this last 15 minutes was to discuss next steps, future plans going forward. I'm grateful to share that Amy, Kaylee, Tammy, and Shawnee have all agreed to continue supporting. And so moving into legislative session, they will be working to kind of track the bills that we have recommended in our report, and so that we can start to have a report out of what's happening with these short-term recommendations that we have made going into the legislative session. And I'm interested to hear from you. I would like to propose that we schedule our next meeting just before session is scheduled to begin, which would be on January the 13th. I'm in denial that we're in December. So that would be Wednesday, January the 13th at the same time that we have been meeting. And that way we will have an idea of what has been introduced by that point in time. And we'll have a report on that. And then Amy, did you want to add anything to that before we go to discussion on that?
No, I think that's really good. I do think one of the things is that earlier in a few meetings ago or several meetings ago, there had been some conversation around how do we as a council or how you all as individuals can support some of the recommendations. And so really want to share that that is our plan as we move forward. Once we hear back from the governor about those things that she wants to push forward, you know, we want to make sure that this council is able to do that. But I also think one of the things I heard was excitement around the idea of advocating even before the legislature starts around the constitutional amendment. And so I know that several of you are excited about that one in particular. I think I just heard from the governor a unqualified yes. She wants to support that. And so I think for those folks who might be interested in doing some work before we get to that next meeting, on maybe doing an op-ed from us that we can talk to the communications department about, or maybe creating some, I think, right, that might be, I'm just putting it out there as an idea of maybe we want to form another work group that can work before the legislature starts and before our next meeting.
That's really good, Amy. And I see, Austin, I see your hand.
Yeah, so I think it's like, I'm glad that we're having this discussion now. You know, we're working on this as an organization, like from where I work, like right now, doing all of the, you know, trying to get our bills in order, figure out who we need to talk to and all that. So this is something that we're really focused on. I'm curious what it looks like from members of the group. Like, is there anyone who does any direct lobbying? I know that we as an organization have plans on doing a substantial amount of direct lobbying. Obviously, it's not going to be in person, so earlier is a lot. It's going to be crucial to be ready to talk to legislators virtually, which means we have to dedicate probably a week to 10 days before before anything severe comes up. So you know, we probably need to have the conversation of like what that looks like from us as individuals first, as well as members of the panel. I'm more than happy to participate in an op-ed on early childhood. I also think that something on the establishment of the racial equity analysis bill, I think that that would be really interesting, even if it is just like a, you know, for discussion's sake. It is important to push that bill forward. So I'm interested to see what everybody has, and if anybody wants to send me an email personally about some of the bills that they're interested in, and what kind of stuff that we're coordinating as people who also are part of other organizations and individuals who might participate in direct lobbying, I'd be happy to start to have some of those conversations. We're already moving forward with a couple of those apart from this. So if anybody wants to send me an email, I'll go ahead and drop that in the chat as well.
Thank you so much, Austin. Does that mean we can sign you up to lead the effort on the op-ed? And coordinating.
I would say somebody else probably definitely should lead a few of those other ones, especially like early childhood. There are probably some very qualified long-term advocates for stuff like that. So I would say that there are better people, but you know, I'm happy to participate where I'm useful.
Thank you. I do see Professor Montoya has said sign her up for the land grant permanent fund work group. Jacqueline, did I see, or Janine and Mr. Sanchez and Senator Lopez? Maybe not. Mr. Sanchez, and then we'll go back. Oh, I'm sorry. Janine, were you talking? Because we can't hear you.
Does that work?
That works.
Thank you. No, I had my hand raised since the governor was on and was trying to ask a question, but for some reason, both the chat feature and the Q&A feature is also not letting me submit a question. I'm not sure if anyone else is having problems. But that's enormously frustrating when we're putting aside our time to be part of these important conversations and we can't effectively participate. So I think this is not the first time we've had issues with this platform, and this is not even what my question was about. But maybe we should also think about the platform that we're using to have these conversations so that we're not having to deal with these types of frustrations. But now that we're talking about the legislative, I don't even think my question bears any relevancy to the current discussion, but I did want to make sure that it was emphasized to the governor that out of necessity and out of a sense of pragmatism, we have been focusing on the legislative session and putting forward recommendations towards that end, but that there are bigger things and other things outside of what could be discussed in January that we also need to start to shift our focus on, especially since in the midst of COVID and with all the attention put onto the pandemic, our communities and on the tribal nations and rural communities are also still grappling and dealing with the impacts of climate change and with how the loss of income is really threatening the survivability through these winter months. And those types of racial injustices as well need to be taken into consideration and in a timely manner. And I'm just really concerned about losing sight of those issues and the severity of them in our communities because so much attention is just being put on what's going to happen in January and how do we lobby. And so that's not my everyday reality. And that's not the reality of the majority of the people that we work with on the ground and who are facing all of these challenges as a result of the pandemic and the result of climate change and the result of the impact to our economies. And I think that we need to start being able to expand our capacity in some way or another so that we can also hold those issues as well.
Thank you for sharing that, Janine. Mr. Sanchez.
I just wanted to let you know to include me on that group. I'm happy to work with Margaret Montoya and others on op-ed.
Wonderful. Thank you. Senator Lopez.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Janine, for sharing. Those are some, just FYI, those are some concerns that have been raised in some of our caucus meetings that we've had in the New Mexico Senate. Democrats about what we are going to do now. And the governor did mention that in January as to how there's still many more things that I think we can do and must do to help our rural communities, especially with this pandemic. So thank you. What I also wanted to mention, Madam Chair, and I know that our majority floor leader in the House, I know you all have a little different perspective maybe on communication issues, but I know that for this coming session, we are all going to be using the same modem with regards for communications. So we will not be using this WebEx. So we'll be using Zoom, which is nice because we learned from the House of how everything went very well during the summer in June for our special session. But I think at our next meeting, we should already have it determined as to what we will do for communication purposes with legislators. There's also been talk about maybe having specific office hours of where we can utilize a Zoom meeting setup, which would also utilize us as a council and others to be, to come and lobby each one of us for particular pieces of legislation or whichever. So that's still to be determined, but I know that by the time we meet, and I think it was January 13th, we should have, at least for the Senate, a better feel for what we're going to be doing with regards to communication, all of those necessaries. And of course, for bill introductions, it's both for the House and Senate. January 1st, from then until the set Friday before legislature starts, we will have the pre-filing of bills. They won't have a number assigned to them this time, but you will see what the intent is of each of us, both House and Senate. And then once opening day comes in, those numbers will then be assigned to the bills at that point in time. So just an FYI update from what I have at this point. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Senator Lopez. And I know when Amy and I spoke earlier today, we talked about we'll be in regular communication as some of these kind of questions are answered around what session is going to look like and what the processes are going to be, so that we have that information in advance of our meeting on the 13th. And so we'll certainly continue communicating about that as well. One final question, comment. I see Jacqueline's hand.
Thank you. Yes, I also was having trouble. My chat is still disabled, but I do want to bring to light, I think, in terms of being in alignment with Janine and her comment, both of us were actually contacted by a very respected community organizer this week in relation to the issues and the contentious nature of the obelisk. And that is happening in Santa Fe. I know that Fatima, Karine, and I did make recommendations as part of our working group with regard to like the renaming and procedure. I know that that wasn't highlighted in what was recommended tonight to the governor. I know that there are a lot of things that are taking precedence, and I recognize that and I understand that, but I think that there's also work that we have to do as a collective in figuring out how, from a community-facing perspective, this council is going to intake and input and use our collective energy and positions to be able to advocate for situations that really do need some sort of truth-telling with the hope of some sort of like movement toward reconciliation and healing. It's something that is becoming really existing to the threat of the livelihoods and safeties of Indigenous women who are at the front lines of these demonstrations, who are protecting and trying to advocate for the placement and just respect of Indigenous cultures here in our communities in these lands, which, as we name, are Indigenous. And I think that it's really important for us to be able to like move forward toward an expansive view of what our council can do and how we develop processes that will help really be in alignment with our community members who are challenged in this time and coming to places where there are stalwarts within other systems of government. I recognize jurisdiction, I recognize all of those things, but for us to come together with all of our voices, our privilege, our perspectives, we can move in a way that is impactful. And so I want to put that forward, and also we'll be sharing like that message so that there's a little more context that can happen outside of this particular meeting. But I just want to lift that up as something that I would like to see us move forward. I would like to be a part of legislation with regard to renaming, because I think because of that alignment and intersection of the obelisk and there being a real issue to address, that is also a subject for op-ed for this legislative session that really needs to have continual conversations that are held. We've talked a lot about that, but I think just the resolution and the visibility of the many different cultures that exist here and the stewards of the land that have continuously provided care for this place that we all make home, I think is really important. So I just want to add that to the conversation tonight. Thank you.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Jacqueline, and I agree with you. And so I really appreciate you lifting that up into this space. And I think that is one of the next steps of our work as a council, is really to be thinking about and come up with that structure and framework. And I want to acknowledge that what was shared tonight, I view all 50 plus recommendations that we as a combined council made as equally important and valuable, and tonight's sharing was not a prioritization of that. It's what myself and the chairs and co-chairs of the committees shared to the senior staff, but we emphasized over and over that we have more work to do and that we viewed all of the recommendations in this interim report as short-term recommendations and really valuable. And so I just want to thank you for lifting that up into this space. And I think that that is one of the next steps. I think that there are people who are very interested in what we have arrived at as a council. And so I think having that conversation and figuring that next piece out is where we are going. So thank you for lifting that up in this space. All right, y'all, I have kept you 3 minutes over, which I don't think has happened before where we've gone over. So again, my gratitude to you all. I'm deeply
Can I just ask a clarifying question?
Yes, Janine.
I want to uphold Jacqueline's recommendation for doing an op-ed on the obelisk as well, and I'm wondering what the process is for that. So I know there's another op-ed that's going to be done. Is a draft of that going to be sent out to the Racial Justice Committee as a whole, or the Central Committee? Do we have time to like input, or what does that look like, so that when we do put, I'm going to work with Jacqueline on this, so when we do put it forward, we know what that process looks like.
So, you know, our responsibility as the council, the advisory council to the governor, is to first provide her with recommendations and then to advocate and support for those recommendations that she has said she wants to move forward. So I heard from her very clearly that she was saying yes to the recommendation about the constitutional amendment, right? And so that is work we can already start on because we've heard from her, yes, she will support that. And so that's the one that we're talking about, creating a working group to do an op-ed. And I think that naturally the work group will kind of start that process and then come back to you all through an email exchange of how you give input to that. The next step on the other 50 plus recommendations is to wait to hear back from the governor and the governor's office about which ones we will be able to really be able to support her in moving those forward. So as far as doing an op-ed or other advocacy around that issue, we need to wait to hear back from her as to how that is going to be moved forward, if that's going to be moved forward.
Thanks for that clarification, Amy. Okay, everyone, deep breath. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much for being here and sharing this space this evening. And we will be in touch soon, but please calendar January 13th at 4 p.m. Good evening.
Everybody stay safe, please.